If you take your seats, we'll go ahead and get started. All right, everyone, it's time to be quiet. Oh, it still works. Our next presenter is taking us in an area we haven't spent a lot of time in, and that's in the Tory side of the house. But he's going to be a surgeon, so I guess we can tolerate that. But before Wade starts, I would ask you to introduce, we're honored today to have a captain from World War II with us, and he'll fill you in.
Thank you, George. Yes, I have a number of family members who are here with me today, and I understand you all recognize some veterans. And my grandfather, Jimmy Scarden, is a veteran of World War II, sitting up in the front row today. My parents and aunt are here as well. I think they'll hear on TV at least a few of us need to be here. Well, I trust stay awake through my presentation today. Thank you very much to the Summers for having me here. And as was already anticipated, I did think that some disclaimers were in order before I began my talk today. As you may have seen in the biographical materials, I'm a lawyer, and lawyers do love disclaimers. And my first disclaimer is that I am definitely not a professional historian. I know that among the luminous speakers at this symposium in prior years was Dr. Joe Stoops, whom we called in my family Uncle Joe. He was married, or he was the brother of, or I should say this, my great uncle was married to Joe Stoops' sister. And I'm not anywhere in his exalted category, and so I'll be happy to entertain questions at the end of my talk, but I fear I'll be quickly out of my depth. And my second disclaimer is this: the subject of my talk today is perhaps an odd one for this conference for at least two reasons. This conference named in honor of the great patriot Francis Marion. First of all, as Mr. Summers already said, he was a loyalist, so he was on the Tory side during the war. But that has a big caveat beside it, as I shall explain later, because he actually remained in the United States. Unlike many loyalists who fought on the Tory side, he remained in the United States after the war. And the second odd thing, I suppose, about him being a fit at this conference is, to my knowledge, he encountered Francis Marion only once, and that was in late February of 1781. He had by that time been a prisoner of war, had been captured, had been imprisoned in Hillsborough, North Carolina. He had been paroled and was on his way back to Charleston and encountered about 40 of Marion's men, perhaps Marion himself, at Black Mingo Ferry. This again was in late 1781. Some of you will know this is Henry Mouzon's map of South Carolina and North Carolina, which was probably the leading battlefield map in the American Revolution by commanders on both sides, had copies. Black Mingo Ferry is on that map, and so that's why I have it up there today. So the encounter itself with Marion was rather uneventful. In total, Marion's men reviewed his parole and let him go on his merry way back to Charleston. But who was this man, Usel Johnson, who is my subject today? I would argue to you he was probably the leading loyalist or Tory chronicler of the Battle of Kings Mountain. And I hope I will be able to convince you of that by the end of my talk. He was a surgeon who served with the Loyalist Regiment during the Revolution, and he kept a diary from approximately March of 1780 to March of 1781 about his military experience in the Carolinas. This diary eventually wound itself into the Boudinot papers that are stored at Princeton University Library. Some of you may know Elias Boudinot was a president of the Continental Congress from 1782 to 83. How a Loyalist diary got into his papers is a little bit of a mystery as well, but that's where it is today. And in my talk, I want to give you something of a flavor and an introduction to his diary. and it will be in basically 5 parts. I want to discuss, first of all, just a brief outline of who this man was, Using Johnson, that kept this diary. I want to give you a little bit of an overview of his involvement in the Revolution, with some mention of the role of a surgeon and a medical man, what role such figures played in revolutionary armies. I want to give you a little bit of a flavor of his journal by reading a few entries that are kind of fireworks and some of the most exciting bits. And then talk about a little bit about him, Kings Mountain itself, and his times of POW, and finally a little bit of the textual mystery that drew me to this journal. As I told you at the beginning, though, I'm a lawyer and was an English teacher before that, and you're probably wondering how in the world did this person get involved in editing the Journal of a Loyalist Surgeon. I was an undergraduate at USC and was then studying under Rob Weir, who some of you may know was the author of Colonial South Carolina History, probably the leading study of the colonial era in South Carolina. He had discovered this journal in the Boudinot papers at Princeton and asked me to help him in editing it. And that was many years ago. It took us about 12 years to do the whole thing, and we finally got it published by USC Press in 2011 or thereabouts. So that's how I got involved, a lawyer and English teacher. And you'll be forgiving, I hope, as we go through it for any lapses on the basis of that other training that I have. So who was this man, Using Johnson? First of all, he was born in April 1751 in Newark, New Jersey. He obtained, let's see if I can get this to advance. There we go. He obtained a medical degree from King's College, which is now Columbia University in New York City. At the ripe old age of 21, it was much easier to obtain a medical degree then, and I suspect when student loans were not nearly as bad. He returned then to Newark to practice medicine. This is, again, he gets the medical degree in about 1772. The next record we have of him is that he was commissioned in a Whig militia unit that was raised in 1776, but right around the time that the Declaration of Independence was issued, that somehow changed his mind about things. And at that point, he defected to the Loyalist cause. His property was confiscated pursuant to laws that had been passed between 1776 and 1778. He eventually gets a surgeon's commission in the New Jersey Volunteers, which is probably one of the largest Loyalist units raised in the United States. Well, it wasn't the United States then, but raised in the colonies. 15,000 Loyalists raised in the colonies. The New Jersey Volunteers composed about 2,500 of that total. He later served in Ferguson's Corps under the famous Major Patrick Ferguson, whom I'll say a little bit more about later. And he saw action in South Carolina, as I mentioned a little earlier, from March 1780 to the Battle of Kings Mountain in October 1780. After his capture, he became a prisoner of war, went to Hillsborough, and then was returned to Charleston in 1781, where his journal ends. So it lasts about a year. Now, as I mentioned, maybe he's a better fit for this crowd than I was hoping, because he was a loyalist, he was a Tory, so he was one of the bad guys from the point of view of us 200 years later. But he stayed in this country, and that makes him rather remarkable. He actually re-entered civilian life in Newark after the war, and why and how he was able to do that is a little bit of a mystery as well. But we do know that doctors were some of the loyalists that were most likely to stay in the country. They were seen as being helpful to society, beneficial, not like their lawyers or people like that. They might be useful. And so they were seen as being able to get on the good graces and good sides of their neighbors and stay in civilian life. He actually ended up becoming a very prominent citizen in Newark, New Jersey, was president of the Medical Society. And other ways he may have re-entered civilian life relatively smoothly is his diary itself, as I'll be talking about in just a few minutes, really shows him to be a compassionate, decent man amidst all the chaos in the backcountry in South Carolina. So if anyone looked at his diary to see what sort of person was this, how did he conduct himself during the war, I think you would come across very favorably, and that he was an honorable person, decent, compassionate to persons on both sides. One other funny way that he may have gotten back in the graces of his fellow neighbors is, although he was an Episcopalian, actually in 1786, he actually made a donation to the building fund of the Presbyterian Church in Newark, New Jersey. Now, I don't know about you, I'm on the building fund, or I'm on the annual giving campaign for my church this year, and we are Episcopalians. I'm just having trouble getting the Episcopalians to give money. I haven't called the Baptists yet. And it probably, though, as you may know, Presbyterians, particularly in that area of New Jersey, as regarded her today, were some of the ones most likely to be on the Whig side. So despite the fact this Episcopalian then gave money to Presbyterians, it was probably in order to get himself back in favor with his fellow neighbors, despite his loyalism and Episcopalianism. But as I said, he did become very prominent. He was on the vestry of Trinity Church, president of the Medical Society. He ended up dying in May of 1827 at the age of 76. So that's a little bit of his overview of his life. Now for his diary itself and what he was doing during the war. His diary takes place against the backdrop of the basic British Southern strategy, which many of you will know. The Revolutionary War starts, of course, in Massachusetts with the skirmishes at Lexington and Concord. The view of the British establishment and the hierarchy at the time was that, this was you had radicals that were in the Northeast, but the view among many in leadership and on the British side was that the Southern colonies were much more sympathetic, were full of loyalists, and that is a view that, of course, the Southern royal governors were only too happy to perpetuate. So that began to change, though, of course, when France in February 1778, Spain in June 1779 entered the war. The British needed support and feared, especially for the West Indies, which were of incredible value. And George Germain, who was then Secretary of State for the American colonies, ordered Henry Clinton to turn his attention to the South. This map conveys something. I realize that the place names and so forth and troop movements are rather obscure from your vantage point, but it does show you those movements towards the South that began to occur in 1780. And of course, it's no coincidence that the talks we heard today already were about many of the events that occur in that 1780, 81, 82 time frame, which were of immense importance as the war moved from the Northeast to the South. So the New Jersey Volunteers, which included Johnson, Usel Johnson, and others, turned south. And Johnson, included in that group, was Ferguson's corps that I mentioned earlier, Major Patrick Ferguson. This is the commander whom Johnson served under. He has been much vilified, of course, by later Patriot commentators, but he really was a rather remarkable military figure for his time. This, again, is the commander that Johnson is under, serving as a surgeon in the New Jersey, later the American Volunteers. Ferguson was 35 at the time. He was, as I say, a rather remarkable military commander, had a lot of ideas about the importance of militias in pacifying a countryside, and really was leading that effort in the backcountry during the 1780 period when Johnson is serving under him as a medical man. And he's remarkable, too, for having invented a pretty ingenious rapid-fire breech-loading rifle that was much more reliable in wet weather. So in addition to being a military man, he was also an inventor. And as some of you may know, we may owe him a very great deal at this gathering. So again, this is another reason that you all should be happy to permit a loyalist to talk. He may have had a chance. There we go. He may have had a chance, as some of you may know, to shoot George Washington, but he held his fire. This was at the Battle of Brandywine, of course, considerably earlier in 1777. Ferguson was out and encountered an American or a Patriot military officer on horseback doing reconnaissance. Ferguson ordered the officer to stop. The officer just coolly turned around and led his horse in the opposite direction. And Ferguson actually held his fire because he was reluctant to shoot someone on the other side who was merely doing his duty. And of course, he would have been shooting him in the back as well. And so we may owe Ferguson a great deal because he later came to believe that the officer whom he encountered was George Washington. And he said also later at the time that he was glad he didn't know that when he had the chance to shoot him. So Johnson is serving under this rather remarkable Scot that is, of course, later killed at Kings Mountain, but more on that in a minute. Johnson himself, however, was a medical man. So a little bit about medicine and medical personnel in the Revolution, because this is a great deal of what his journal concerns. Of course, 18th century medicine, we're talking about a radically different time in the history of medicine. The causes of disease and infection were very little understood. Physicians were very limited, too, in the sort of treatment that they could do. Most people realized they might do you more harm than good. Johnson was considered by at least one soldier a very capable surgeon. However, this person under his treatment also died. So we might question the value of that estimation. Surgeons, too, were really the persons who did the dirty work back then. This was what I have on the overhead is a typical medical man's supply kit back in the Revolutionary period. This could have been carried around by Revolutionary War surgeons. I don't know if you can see in the bottom, I'd say, third of the kit is basically a hacksaw. So it gives you a sense of the rather grisly tasks that were often appointed to the surgeons. Particularly in Europe, surgeons were seen as sort of being of a lower class than doctors. They did the dirty work, the cutting, the sawing, and the hard labor. Doctors were really the apothecaries, the pharmacists who were doing the sort of educated work. And as a practical matter, there were only 2 medical schools in the United States, or in the colonies during Johnson's time. He happened to have graduated from one, but by far most surgeons would not have graduated or had a medical degree. He certainly did, but that was unusual. Most surgeons would have trained by an apprenticeship system or something like that. And that distinction that existed in the old world between surgeons and the more exalted doctors who were upper class, the surgeons who were lower class, persisted to some extent in the colonies, but to a great extent it broke down. Curiously, though, in South Carolina, and the old stigma remained in some fashion during the colonial era. In fact, surgeons were supposed to be unfit to serve on juries because they were thought to be less compassionate than other men. You'll remember this is the time before anesthesia as well, and so the surgery really was quite brutal sorts of things. And 2, as one reads Johnson's journal, one of the treatments were rather rough and brutal. In fact, the most common was bleeding, and this was considered a treatment for almost anything that ailed you back then. Johnson has to treat some women who have been roughed up by a villain at one point in his journal, and the treatment that he gives to them is bleeding. This image itself is taken from the George Washington bedside. Some of you may know his treating physician came under much criticism at the time after Washington's death for perhaps having led Washington too severely. So bleeding was, of course, one of the common treatments, and you can imagine the sort of success that had. Typically, it was recommended for any wound of the chest and abdomen. Someone suffering such a wound was told to be bled all he could bear, and 16 to 24 ounces was typically the amount that was taken. I imagine it would calm you down by the fact that it weakened you, but it certainly did no good from a medical point of view, but of course it was not thought at the time. So that gives you a little bit of a flavor of medical life during the war. Now, what is Johnson's diary against the backdrop of? These are the major events. It opens in March 1780. He travels to Charlestown in May 1780. He was not present at the Battle of the Waxhaws, but he records a note about that battle taking place. He was not present at all these military engagements, so I'm trying to give you a frame of when he was writing and acting. Battle of Hanging Rock, Camden, and then, of course, captured at Kings Mountain. He was not at Cowpen because this was during the time when he was a prisoner of war. And then it closes again in 1781, right before the Battle of Guilford Courthouse. So those are the sort of major events going in. Now, what I'd like to do, having given you that frame for when the diary is taking place, is give you a little flavor for what the diary itself sounds like. And this, again, is what my co-editor and I, Dr. Weir, were editing. The diary is of particular interest, I would say, for 3 aspects that it tells us about the Revolution. And first, as you may have already anticipated, was medical care. As you know, Johnson was a medical man, and the first reading I'd like to give to you was from 14 to 15 April 1780. So this is just before, of course, the battle or the fall of Charleston. And here's one of his entries from that time. 3 ladies came to our camp in great distress, Lady Colleton, Miss Betsy Giles, and Miss Jane Russell.
They had been shockingly abused by a plundering villain. Lady Colleton, badly cut in the hand by a broadsword and bruised very much. After I dressed her wounds, I went with an officer and 12 men to the plantation a mile from camp to protect Miss Faisou, whom this villain had likewise abused in like manner. Here I found a most accomplished and amiable lady in the greatest distress imaginable. After taking a little blood from her and giving her an anodyne, she was much more composed and came next morning to camp to testify against the villain that had abused them in this horrid manner. He was executed. He was then secured and sent to headquarters. They catch the thief, who was well rewarded for his knavery. The ladies chose our protection rather than stay at home and begged we would conduct them a few miles to a plantation called Mulberry Broughton. Some of you will know. There's Mulberry. Anybody been to Mulberry Broughton? Instantly here? Imagine you did that. So he's visiting houses, some plantation houses, churches, meeting houses, and so forth that some of you may well have been to. In some cases, are still standing. So that's an early record. It shows you again the bleeding, his interest in people as a medical officer, and really his role was in sort of background treating persons who were victims, in this case, of the sort of violence that was going on, the lawlessness, you might say, in the backcountry. Here's another pretty interesting, let me read you just a little bit of his entry from 12 May. Now, 12 May 1780 is, of course, the fall of Charleston. So what was Johnson doing? At 10 o'clock in the morning, the gates were open. These are the gates of Charleston. Many of you know Charleston was a walled city at that time. The gates were open. General Leslie, at the head of the British Grenadiers, the 7th, 63rd, 64th Regiments, and Hessian Grenadiers, marched in and took possession of Charlestown and soon leveled the 13 stripes with the dust and displayed the British standard on the ramparts. This day, Captain Frederick de Peyster and I went 16 miles up the Wando River and took a quantity of bark, salts, camphor, opium, jala, ipecacuanha, manicantharides, and these are other medicines at the time, that had been sent out of Charleston and deposited at Dr. Lucock's for safety. I sent in a list of them to the commissary of captures. This was the CVS to Rite Aid at the time, and he was basically collecting medicines, as you can tell. The things that he mentions in there are rather interesting itself. Some of you will recognize pokeberry. It's sort of a weed plant that grows in people's yards right now. At the time, however, it was used as a purgative for rheumatism, and an ointment for sore eyes, and a poultice for insect bites. I have no idea whether it does any good for those things. I'm told eating the berry can be incredibly dangerous. It will produce hallucinations right before your heart stops. Ipecac, he mentions in there too, was an emetic. Cantharides, those were used, that was actually a part of the Spanish fly, and it was used to make blistering plasters. So it was thought at the time that raising a blister on the skin had some healing effect in certain circumstances. So he was off getting medicines and so forth. So that gives you a little bit of the medical flavor of the diary. There were also, as I mentioned in this diary, he has quite a few accounts that he's hearing secondhand. I won't read you this, but he hears a report of the Battle of the Waxhaws, infamous as Tarleton's Massacre. He hears a report of that. We don't get the negative commentary that certainly later patriots have put on that battle, but those are the sort of records in here as well. And the third really interesting thing I would say about his journal, and I will read you a few of these, Miss Ingle told us this morning about payback time in the backcountry. And this map shows you a few of the places that he was in the backcountry. After the fall of Charleston, Johnson and Ferguson were traveling mostly in the backcountry in South Carolina. Back up a little bit. Up until the Battle of Kings Mountain. But the other interesting thing about life in the backcountry is a little bit of the flavor of what Miss Ingle characterized as payback time. And I think it is worth being aware, as focused as we are on the atrocities and injustices that occurred to various supporters of the Patriot cause, equally so when the, you might say, when the Patriots held sway, they were very willing to take out revenge on those who were supporting the Loyalist side, of whom there were quite a few around 96th District, for example. And I think one of the more remarkable, he has several sort of remarkable stories of loyalists who suffered a great deal. So I thought I'd read you a couple of those. This is from his entry of June 10, 1780. This day met us Henry Malcolm, an old gentleman, 81 years old. He had left home with an intention to go to Charlestown and had walked upwards of 100 miles when he met us. His errand was to get some kind of assistance. He had been plundered and stripped of everything by the rebels. What is more remarkable is that this old Abraham left a child at home only 2 years old. So you see a loyalist in distress, 81 with a 2-year-old child. I'd love if he was from Edgefield and maybe a distant relative of strong government. But you do get a sense that loyalists, I'm glad there are a few people in here this story. You do get a sense that loyalists were very much suffering at this time, as well as patriots, of course, in the backcountry. One other example of that, I'll read to you his entry from the 5th of September. Moved at 5 in the evening and marched 1.5 miles to the Packlet River. The fresh so high and clear that we could not ford it. I took quarters at Mr. Coleman's, a quarter mile from camp. Mrs. Coleman is a very warm Tory. She has 2 sons in Colonel Ennis's corps. She has a family of small children and has been a mother of 5 in 2 years. Go figure that. They have been greatly distressed by the rebels for their loyalty, their house stripped of all the beds and other furniture, and the children of all their clothes. So she had 5 children running around with no clothes on. And one other from 14th of September. I think this is a really funny one as well. The deluded people come in very fast. They say they have never heard of any terms being offered, but have always been kept in ignorance and told of the cruelty of the English. One poor woman expressed great surprise at seeing our men so mild. She asked if there was not heathen in our army that eat children. She had been told there was. They had never seen a proclamation. This is referring to Clinton's proclamation of amnesty that was afforded after the fall of Charlestown. Anyway, that gives you a little bit of the flavor of the journal. I think it's pretty interesting, and I'll read you a little bit of the Kings Mountain account in just a second. But it's pretty interesting for those 3 aspects in particular: occasional accounts of military battles like the Battle of the Waxhaws, certainly the medical aspects of it. You've got to remember Johnson was a military man himself and a medical man. And so there's a great deal of interest in the landscape, in trees, in plants that might be used for medical purposes. It has something of the tone, if I were to characterize it, of that sort of 18th century Enlightenment rationalist. He was a scientist, a medical man, so he's very interested in the weather, very interested in the landscape, very interested in plants and so forth, because they may have been important to him in the work that he was doing. And then finally, I think it's interesting for the portrait that it gives us of some of the persecution of loyalists going on in the backcountry during that time of payback, that time of chaos, when there was a lot of disorder in the South Carolina backcountry. But the title of our the journal we call Captured at Kings Mountain, because that probably highlights the most famous aspect of this journal. The Kings Mountain story I will not recount in full here, but many of you will be very familiar with it, I don't doubt. Let's see if I can pull up troop movements. The basic background, however, to it is after Cornwallis's, of course, great victory in August 1780 at Camden, he began very slowly heading toward Charlotte with the idea of pacifying North Carolina as being a key to all of this. His men, by that point, were rather depleted by the harsh South Carolina summer. I suppose global warming may very well be real, but it was very hot still back then in South Carolina, and his men were quite tired and diseased and so forth, and so they were making their way very slowly. Major Patrick Ferguson, again, whom Johnson was serving under, had the job of protecting the left flank of Cornwallis's army heading up towards Charlotte, and had also been active in the 96th District, again raising militia. Ferguson was very interested in that. And it was during the fall, or early fall of 1780, that Ferguson had sent a message, very famously, you will know this, to Isaac Shelby and the Over Mountain men. And he had been leading people from across the Appalachian Mountains into various actions in South Carolina. And he threatened them that he would cross the mountains, execute their leaders, and lay waste to the countryside should they dare mess with him. And to quote Ms. Engel, who already chose this line, that is not the way you win friends and influence people by threatening to burn their homes and execute their leaders. And that stirred quite a few people up. Perhaps as many as 1,000 mounted riflemen met at the Watauga River in eastern Tennessee in late September and September 25th. They were preached to by a very fiery Presbyterian who sent them on their way with God on their side. And they eventually caught up with Ferguson at Kings Mountain on October the 7th, 1780. It's curious why Ferguson should have stopped there. He was actually relatively near the main British force at the time, and furthermore, he knew he was being pursued. But as you will know, or some of the military people in the audience will know, typically the height is the better position in a battle. In this case, though, as these forces surrounded them, it ended up not being advantageous. The British made for pretty good targets sitting at the top of the hill. You had these very skilled riflemen around them. They were able to use the boulders and trees going up the side of the mountain as protection, and so therefore they ended up ultimately being successful. And so at this point, I'll shoot through a few of these slides. This gives you the basic troop movements at the Battle of Kings Mountain itself. You can see where the various Patriot units were surrounding the main British force there. And then this is, of course, the famous scene where Patrick Ferguson himself is ultimately shot down. He's very dear to my knowledge and was killed at this battle. Johnson himself was involved in treating persons on both sides of the battle. Unusually, he's not present at most of the big military engagements, but of course he is right there for this battle. And he has a very detailed account of the troops coming in on them, surrounding them, the various charges that were made, Ferguson being shot down himself. And then the battle lasts about an hour and 5 minutes, according to his account. And at the end of it, he's actually involved in treating men on both sides of the battle, and that's chiefly why we know him now. So here is some of you. How many people have been to Kings Mountain? Yeah, many. There's, of course, the monument to Patrick Ferguson, who was killed there. And then there's, of course, the monument at the top. Now, after the battle, about 700 prisoners of war were taken on the Tory side, and Johnson is one of those. He is taken to Hillsborough, North Carolina, where he actually enjoyed. He pretty much was sort of own his honor as a prisoner of war. He could actually come and go rather freely. A great friend of his escaped from the pretty loose security that was provided. And he actually was even able to continue his medical practice in some fashion. And he was involved in inoculating a number of the more prominent Hillsborough residents and their children for smallpox. And this actually is one of the medical things that was probably useful back then. So this was probably a good thing, but he did get some of the local physicians mad at him because he appeared to be cutting into their practice a little bit and taking some of the inoculation cases. So this is a photograph of how inoculations were done back during this time. Usually a cut was made in order to, and then the pus from the pox sores was inserted. So that was a good medical practice that was used back in that day. And Johnson was able to treat a number of people even while he was a prisoner of war in Hillsborough. As I mentioned, other physicians, however, got jealous, and he did get a little bit of trouble for that. But he was eventually paroled and sent back to Charleston, and that's, of course, when he encounters Francis Marion's men. So that's the journal in a nutshell. But then one final little piece of it, and then I'll open the floor for questions and appreciate your patience. How did I get interested in this, and how did my co-editor, Bob Weir, get interested in this? Has anybody out there read Kings Mountain and Its Heroes by Lyman Draper? A few people. This is probably the most famous account of the Battle of Kings Mountain. Published in 1881, it was meticulously researched by the author, Lyman Draper. And he was in many cases corresponding with descendants of persons who had been at Kings Mountain. It was really an elegant piece of history from the 19th century. At any rate, there is a journal in that work by Anthony Allaire. And Anthony Allaire was a loyalist. He was also in Ferguson's corps. And that journal is remarkably similar, I would even say verbatim in many parts, to Usul Johnson's journal, which my editor and I, Bob Weir, published. At places in Johnson's journal, he refers to my friend Allaire. At places in Allaire's journal, he refers to my friend Johnson. And we were wondering what in the world was going on when you have somebody evidently was copying somebody if parts of the journal are verbatim. Now, there are interesting differences between the two. Allaire's journal seems to be more stridently pro Tory, you might say. He oftentimes avoids, he was a regular military man as opposed to Johnson, the surgeon. He avoids being directly critical of his officers who are above him. Johnson seems to have a much more compassionate view towards women and treat them far less as sort of objects of commentary than Allaire does in his journal. But clearly, one of them was copying from the other. And we were trying to figure out, well, who was copying from whom. It looks like Allaire's journal, published in this, has much more regular spelling. In many cases, place names tend to be more accurate. Based on that and a number of other bits of evidence, we've concluded that we think Johnson was actually the original diary taker, and that Allaire, who was out in the field fighting battles and that sort of thing, while Johnson was back mostly behind the lines, treating people and doing those sorts of tasks. He had time to keep a journal. Allaire probably didn't. Allaire, when he was less busy, would come and catch up by just copying large stretches of Johnson's journal. So that's that prompted, I guess, our interest in how in the world did this happen, where these two journals are more or less alike. They're interesting discrepancies, as I say, and Allaire's, as I say, was much more stridently pro-Tory. And it's therefore not surprising at all, perhaps, that it was Anthony Allaire who should leave the colonies after the war. He was a loyalist. He ended up settling in Nova Scotia, whereas our much more compassionate Usul Johnson ended up staying and becoming a U.S. citizen. And that can kind of be, you can discern that that was probably the path they were on by a line-by-line comparison of these two journals. And that stands to reason after you line them up, I think. But the two men evidently remained friends throughout the war, even after they were paroled. Allaire was involved in a rather infamous incident in Charleston, dueling with someone who killed the person with whom he was dueling, and Johnson was actually a witness in the court-martial that occurred later that acquitted Anthony Allaire. So Allaire ends up in Nova Scotia, Johnson in Newark, New Jersey. They remain friends. Johnson actually names one of his children Isaac Allaire later, so they evidently did remain friends. But Johnson becomes the U.S. citizen. Allaire stays true to his loyalist roots and the king and moves to Nova Scotia. So those take you through the mysteries of this journal, how I got interested in it, a little bit of the background to it, and having said those commentaries, I'm reminded now that as a former English teacher, it was always a challenge to have the classes that were right before lunch. And the 7th grade students would look longingly at the clock in anticipation of the lunch that was before. And so far I would say that you all are far better behaved than my 7th graders. But I'm also aware that you might be looking longingly at the clock and at luncheon. So I will stop there and would be happy to entertain any questions. Yes, sir.
I've got 2 or 3 questions, but I'll just give you 2.
Okay.
And they should be simple. Did he charge a fee for inoculation? And the other one I'm going to ask you, does anyone here or you know of any monument anywhere in this country to a slain soldier of the other side? When I went to Kings Mountain with my wife, I was stupefied of seeing this monument. I understand that he was a great hero for Britain and had developed that rifle and supposedly had seen Washington and didn't shoot him. But does anyone know, without repeating the question again, does anyone know of any monument to an enemy of the United States?
There's one at Utah Springs on the battleground.
And who was the enemy?
It was a British captain, I believe.
Is there really?
There's one at Concord Bridge. There are 3 soldiers buried there on a little memorial.
Well, that's kind of, okay, so you've answered my question. I think it's fabulous. I was not able to do that.
Sure. On the first question, the inoculation fee, I don't think he recalls receiving a fee. Now, that doesn't mean that he didn't. It may have gone, I wouldn't be surprised if somehow that went to his care or food while he was a captive. But there's not a mention one way or the other from what I recall about that. That's a good question. I'm not sure. I know, as I say, he was making the locals mad. So he was cutting into their fees, but I don't know that he was necessarily getting money
Well,
back
you can
himself.
see, if he didn't charge a fee, that they'd be,
Yes.
use an overused term, annoyed.
Sure, yes, sir.
I noticed when I read the journal, he was fascinated with women. Was he married? 'Cause he always talked about women.
He was quite a young, yes, he was quite a young man. So was Alaire. Both of them were in their mid-20s at the time. Neither of them was married. Johnson later married a year. He married in 1783 and it was right after the War. Alaire, there's some interesting incidents where Alaire sort of makes some romantic innuendo about women that they will meet. And Johnson doesn't say those things. And that's one of the interesting differences between the two journals. And there's a thought that Alaire sort of fancied himself more of a ladies' man, and Johnson was more professional and objective, I guess, in how he treated women.
But then when he marched up around Gilbertown, he was talking about how fierce the women were in that area, how mean they were. Weak women.
He later married, I know that part. There's a rumor that Ferguson had his mistress with him. Of course, some of you will know that. In some cases, this was not uncommon in the troops that were moving around. Oh, two? Okay.
Yes.
Very progressive. Yes, sir.
You mentioned that Johnson came in contact with Marion's men. Was any clear
That's all he says. He says with Marion's men at Black Mingo Creek, he doesn't say about 40 of them. He does give a number too. He doesn't say whether Marion was there. Could have been, I guess, but it's not clear one way or the other. Thank you all. Oh, yes, sir.
real quick, is your grandfather's name James Loring Scardon?
Yes, he's here.
Did he have a brother named Ambrose Hooper Scardon?
Yes, that was my great uncle. He was a history professor at, let's see, no, excuse me, he lived in Spartanburg.
Ambrose Hooper Scardon III was married to my sister Jennifer.
Oh, okay. We'll connect afterwards. Yes.
Is there any archaeological area that they reconstructed or anything around Hillsborough where the prisoners were?
You know, that's a good question. I have been to Hillsborough a couple of times when I was in school in North Carolina, and it's a really well-preserved town with lots of old historic homes. It's quite charming. I remember seeing, when I was walking around the town, a number of homes of people that Johnson visited. But I don't remember if there was anything about the prisoners, what exactly. There may well be something there, I just don't know. It's worth a visit, though. I'd like to go back one of these days. Thank you all for your attention.